When it's ripe, they're not stuck together. And what happens is they just move. And that's why it softens. And the enzyme which is responsible for that is something which is called, and you can see from that PG in red, it's something called polygalacturonase. You don't need to know what it is. It just actually breaks down the glue. And if you have a look at the difference in proteins between those present in the green fruit and the red fruit, the major difference is that during these few days, the plant produces loads of this stuff which breaks down the glue. Well, can we stop it? Can we use our technology? Can we actually put in an antisense gene? And what would happen? Because if you stop those cells from falling apart, it should still ripen, it should still smell good, it should still taste good, it just will soften a lot more slowly. And that work was done. Antisense lines were made, and you can see there that that particular band, those antisense lines, different lines have got less of that material, and they've got less of the enzyme. But the most important thing to us is, does it work? Well, I don't know how many of you are anti-GM, but this is what I'm going to ask you to eat if you're anti-GM. Looks very palatable. That's what happens to the natural fruit if you leave them on the bench for a period of time. They fall apart, they get infected. This is the GM. In other words, they don't soften nearly as quickly, and potentially you end up with a product with a much longer shelf life. And one of the things we want to do is make sure that we actually waste less. And that was actually turned into a commercial product. That work was done here. And you could go into Safeways, for those of you who remember Safeways, and go into Sainsbury's and buy this product, and it was cheaper than the non-GM product. It was cheaper because you could get more tomato puree per unit tomato. Well, that's what happens if you engineer one part of the process. What happens if you engineer the ethylene production? Well, ethylene production is also a linear pathway. Again, you don't need to have the information, but just those of you who do want a bit more information, it's a linear pathway catalyzed by two enzymes, one at the beginning and one at the end. Let's block that second enzyme in the same way we've done before. Introduce a gene which is a mirror image. So this is what we would in essence be doing. We would be blocking that last bit, and therefore the plant would be producing less ethylene. But if you produce less ethylene, the fruit are going to ripen more slowly. The whole thing is going to be delayed, not just the softening, the colour change, all the other bits and pieces. Does it work? Well, it's been done in tomato, but it's done in melon. This is probably more of an impact. Again, if you're an anti-GM person, that is the melon that I'm going to give you for lunch. If you can tolerate GM, you can have that one. The interesting thing about working on this sort of thing is that many of us who don't do it just because we're driven to resolve a particular problem. Sometimes we do it because of the fun, because you never quite know what's going to come out. And one of the things that came out of this was that when you manipulate ethylene, you actually discover it's not just ripening which is affected. So this is a tomato plant which has got normal amounts of ethylene, and the leaves go yellow. This is a tomato plant where the ethylene is reduced. They stay green much longer because ethylene is important for the yellowing process. Now, we don't tend to eat tomato leaves, so maybe not so important, but if that was sprouts or broccoli or lettuce or another leafy vegetable, can you extend the shelf life? Interestingly enough, the same gas is important for the longevity of flowers. This is carnation. Those of you who eat carnation, that's what you'd have to eat. And that's the one which has been genetically engineered. So you discover things about how a process operates, which is the fantastic thing about what we do. So I've talked about how you can introduce single changes, resistance to insect, herbicides, viruses, how you can potentially use a new technique to manipulate shelf life. GM also gives you the opportunity of making potentially novel products. This is something you couldn't possibly achieve by conventional breeding. And I'll give you an example of one of these in a moment. And these are some of the things that are proposed. Vaccines, so that you'll go along and rather than actually be vaccinated, you go along to your local supermarket and buy a banana which will contain the vaccine in it. It's unlikely that you do that, but you can imagine that if you were living in another country where getting vaccines around the country is extremely difficult because they have to be kept at low temperature, there may be opportunities about having plants that produce their own vaccines. Let's talk about one example, because I'm coming to the end, but I think this is a very important one. This is something called golden rice. Golden rice is a very interesting potential product, but there have been issues about it. Most of us only eat rice on a Saturday night after we've been to a pub and suddenly it seems nice to go out and have that extra meal. But for many, many people, rice is something which is consumed as a staple diet. It's something which they have day in, day out, and is very, very important to them. There's a problem with rice, and that is that in addition to being a major crop, it contains no provitamin A. This is something which is very, very important to us, and we convert it into vitamin A. And something like 400 million people actually are deficient of vitamin A. And if you're a child and you're deficient of vitamin A, it can lead to blindness. So this is a major problem. And it isn't as if we can breed a variety of rice which contains vitamin A in the rice grain, because it doesn't exist. There isn't the genetic material to do that. And it's also very difficult to tell people who use rice as their staple that they need to supplement it with something else, oranges or peppers. That may happen, but at the same time, it's very, very difficult to achieve. So can we introduce a rice with vitamin A? Well, this is the way it was done, and this was done about 15 years ago, so it's not something which is new. And that was to take genes from the daffodil and introduce them into rice. It was quite a complicated process and required a number of steps. And that did generate golden rice. You can see the hand on your right has got the golden rice in it. But there have been lots of issues about this, and this hasn't actually yet got into the marketplace, largely as a consequence of people being resistant to it. So why are people resistant? Why are they opposed to GM crops? Well, there has been some bad publicity, and you only need one particular piece of information which suggests there could be an issue. And some of you remember that about 10, 15 years ago, there was information about genetically engineered potato being fed to rats, and it caused problems. And you get headlines such as this. You can see the date of it. I mean, blind date's not been on your screen, not that I ever watched it, but it's also the butt of bad jokes. This is one that I particularly liked. And a number of pressure groups decided that GM was a technology that they weren't comfortable with, and they decided that they would put a lot of weight behind this, and this caused all sorts of issues to the point where people were actually destroying crops growing in the field that they were thought to be GM. And the commercial sector also saw this as an opportunity, and I don't in any way blame them. I would have done as well if I'd been involved in this, by actually saying we don't have any GM products, then you're going to bring in potentially more customers. So what are the concerns?